Mari Reesberg. Over the past several years, I've combined my degrees in acting and somatic psychology to share my sustaining creativity techniques with performers. And now I've decided to share it with a bigger audience that includes you. I believe we are all creative, and this podcast is all about that. I'll be interviewing people from all backgrounds, ages, and creativity experiences to share just how creative we all are. Today, I'll be chatting with Sarah DeGrave, theater artist and ADHD-informed life coach. Please enjoy Sarah DeGrave. Welcome to the Sustaining Creativity Podcast. Today, I am here with Sarah DeGrave, theater artist and ADHD-informed life coach. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
I'm super excited to dive into creativity with you, how it shows up in your life. But before we get there, why don't you take a couple of minutes and let our listeners know a little bit more about who you are and what you do?
Yeah, well, as you mentioned, I am a theater artist, and I say ADHD-informed life coach. There are like a lot of ways to kind of frame that title. That's just the one that kind of appeals to me at the moment because it's kind of merging those like life coaching, but through a lens. So through like an ADHD-informed lens. And I think I also use the term just ADHD coaching a lot, but then I feel like sometimes the focus goes too much onto the ADHD part, and it's like we're just using that as a filter,
Right.
because it's informative and helpful sometimes. But there's so many other things that are the focus of those coaching for most of my clients. It's like creative projects or other life goals, and so that's kind of where I've ended up. But I started and still am also a theater artist and primarily a performer. As with most people, you know, I've had my foot in many areas of the theater, but primarily performing and musical theater is my home and my love.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, it's kind of been an interesting journey. I think that's a part of how I ended up where I am now, is that as theater artists, which I believe you are also.
Yes.
So you understand this kind of needing to piece together a lot of things and get creative about what our careers look like and what our life looks like. And sometimes that can lead us in interesting directions.
Absolutely. I'm curious, can you tell us a little bit about how you got into the life coaching, and then more specifically with that ADHD lens?
Yeah. So it kind of started with actually becoming a restorative exercise coach. So I also was / am a little bit, it's not really my focus at the moment, certified restorative exercise specialist, which is just a lot of words to say, like, you know, someone who teaches you how to move better and move more, focused on alignment and natural movement and corrective exercises, that type of work. And that was something that I came across through my own kind of curiosity and, you know, wellness journey, and also wanting to find something that was a complementary career to performance work. And that led me, that was kind of my first time branching off into, I guess, running my own business in a sense, you know, being like an independent contractor in terms of that type of work, and kind of a more coaching, teaching relationship. And I was always like very interested in personal development topics and kind of drawn toward life coaching before I would even really let myself explore it. I think a lot of it has to do with, I mean, I feel like there's a stigma around life coaching sometimes, and definitely personally, I was like, I don't like, there's something that just makes me cringe about like calling myself a life coach.
Sure.
And so it took me a while to kind of like work through that and allow myself
Yeah.
to follow that curiosity and follow, the cues of my life of that it really did make sense with my skill set and what I wanted to do and what I was interested in. And so it kind of became this progression where I was doing restorative exercise, but the topics that I was talking about were often around, making being informed so that you can make personal choices about your
Yeah.
body, but then
Mm-hmm.
also your life, like your lifestyle and movement are so intertwined.
Yeah.
So I was kind of eking in that direction. And
Okay.
then finally got to the point where I was like, okay, I'm going to focus on my business. I'm going to quit my part-time job because this was before I knew I had ADHD, but I knew that I needed to kind of like pull the rug out from underneath myself to get myself to take action, which
Mm-hmm.
that's a very ADHD thing. But I was like, I don't know why I can't just be a stable person, but I need to like do something drastic to make myself
Yeah.
function. Um, and that was like right before the pandemic. That was end of 2019.
Oh, wow.
I went into 2020 being like, okay, this is the year where I build out like my restorative exercise coaching in-person classes. I was like very focused on this is a year of like in-person teaching and building relationships.
Yeah.
And then, of course, a few months later, that all didn't make sense anymore.
Right.
And then through the pandemic, there was this gradual transition of, okay, I don't really love teaching movement online. It's totally possible, but I don't love it. So if I'm going
Mm-hmm.
to be coaching online, I might as well let myself, explore life coaching. Then I got diagnosed with ADHD, and that became a component. So it kind of was this progression of
Yeah.
the other part of it was I also missed working with creative people.
Mm-hmm.
And while I had tried to kind of draw that into my restorative exercise work, it hadn't really crossed over as well as I was hoping.
Yeah.
And it kind of so I started going toward coaching creative people, then
Nice.
incorporated the ADHD lens,
Mm-hmm.
which was very complementary because of course there are so many.
Ah, yes.
I often just think of ADHD folks as creatively wired anyway. So
Absolutely. Yeah. Nice. Well, thank you for sharing kind of the
yeah,
progression and how you ended up where
the
you are. And
meandering path.
yeah, no, it's fantastic. Well, when you kind of think about creativity, your own creativity, or just creativity in general, what does it mean to you to be creative?
That's an interesting question because I feel like it comes up with my clients a lot in that I I say oftentimes when I'm introducing myself or putting out information about my services that I specialize in working with creatives
Mhm.
and solopreneurs and some other categories. But sometimes then I'll have consultations with people and they'll be like, "Well, I'm not really like a creative," and I'm like, "That's that's
Yeah.
fine, but also like probably you are."
Yeah.
And what's interesting is sometimes when I ask people what they do, they're like, well, I'm a designer. But like, so I'm like, you're doing something that to me is very obviously creative.
Yeah.
Um, but there's such a link between like creativity and being an artist, I feel like being artistic.
Hmm.
And so to me, creativity, there's definitely that overlap with artistry, but there's
Hmm.
also a component, that's totally separate from that most people have. And a lot of the business owners I work with are very creative. Like it's essentially you're taking an idea, you're
Yeah.
you have a vivid imagination and you're like building something out of nothing.
Yeah.
And that to me, or solving puzzles, solving problems, solving puzzles, building things, making things happen,
Yeah.
all of that.
Absolutely. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I too have heard people say, "Oh, I'm really not that creative, but I love color coding everything on my calendar." And I'm like, "Oh, that's very creative. Like that is a
Yeah.
creative expression of who you are." So, yeah. When you come across people who struggle to identify their own creativity or call themselves creative, how do you navigate that? What are some of the ways that you traverse that the tundra of creativity with them?
I think it depends on the situation. Like in the coaching that I'm doing, people aren't necessarily coming to me to like explore their creativity,
Yeah.
because I'm not explicitly doing creative coaching. Just the people I work with tend to be in those fields, like those industries.
Yeah.
But for people who are wanting to kind of access that more, I find that actually a lot of the tools, like the ADHD lens tools, kind of help with that, because there's, well, one thing that pops into my mind is this kind of correlation between ADHD and perfectionism, which is something that I hadn't known about before I started studying. And I find that perfectionism is such, such a dampener on
Yeah.
creativity. That, and just like not allowing ourselves to work in ways that are intuitive to us. So it's kind of like removing these barriers instead of, I think sometimes people come at it as I need to like add something on, but sometimes it's like we need to take things away to like
Okay.
free it up. So that's like one kind of
Yeah.
approach to it. But I think also like taking away, I feel like for some reason people feel embarrassed if they're not creative. Like the energy that they come to me with when it's like they're admitting something shameful.
Right. They kind of whisper it like, I'm not actually creative.
And I'm like, regardless of whether that's true, like, why do you feel bad about it? Like, I'm not a lot of things. Like, there are a lot of things that are not my strength. I don't
Yeah.
feel like they need to be.
Yeah. That makes sense to, the taking away of things instead of putting things on. Because it sounds like many people have acquired a lot of stuff that
Yes.
they're holding and trying to fit into, and by taking things away, are able to find more of that authenticity or that intuitive aspect that you were talking about of how what works for them may look very different than what works for other people, whether in
Yeah.
their family or office or whatever it is they're choosing to do.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So when you kind of think about your own creative journey, what's your earliest memory of being creative?
My earliest memory is probably, I have a sister who's 2 years older than me. So I had a playmate when I was younger. And I feel like doing things with her, and also we had a good kind of neighborhood group of kids. Those are my earliest creative memories, but the like very specific memory that pops into my head is that we had like a radio slash cassette player that you could record, and we would like record ourselves just being nonsensical. But also I remember one time we kind of recorded our own audiobook. It was, those books where I think we had books on tape where you could read along and then it would ding, when you turn the page. And
Yeah.
so as the younger sister who couldn't read yet, my sister, I think we had to like a Dr. Seuss book, and she would read it and she'd be like, okay, your job is to ding. And when it's time to turn the page, I seem to remember that I might have got a little impatient or a little resistant to her telling me what to do, and the dings might have gotten out of control. But just that, like, being in a room with someone and messing around.
Yeah. I love it. It sounds very, very sisterly in that
Yes.
dynamic of playing and putting things together. And I think
Yeah.
I am the older sibling in my family, so I recall those moments with my younger sibling and how how they chose to show up
Yes.
in the play. So
And then I had neighbors who were younger than me, so then I became the director of the of the
yeah.
crew.
Yeah. So how has some of that kind of playfulness in childhood, how have you like kept that going into adulthood? How do you still cultivate that for yourself today?
That's something that I actually struggle with a lot. I find myself really having trouble, and maybe I was a little bit this way as a child also, but like being able to really relax and just have
Yeah.
fun and be playful and
Mhm.
access joy. Those are all things that are like constantly on my like goals list. And just like they don't just come naturally to me. And
Yeah.
so I do have to kind of consciously think about that. And
Mhm.
um, I find the thing that's kind of been most helpful for me so far is staying connected to communities that support that.
Yeah.
So, like, staying connected to theater work is obviously, that is a space where that is not only accepted but expected.
Sure. Yeah.
and can be a healthy challenge for me to live up to that. Okay, this is a space where you need to just practice letting go a little bit and
Yeah.
having fun and enjoying being creative with other people
Mhm.
who also love to be creative.
Yeah. They're great goals to have. Having, I mean, why
Yeah.
wouldn't we have those on our goals list all the time?
Access joy.
Absolutely. Yeah. But thank you for your honesty. I think, yeah, I think people, definitely do struggle with continuing to find the playfulness or the joyfulness in that kind of everyday activity
Hmm. And I
as
think
we get older.
there's so much in our lives as we get older where we don't have like all of these structured activities and community,
Right.
and we're just not only loaded on with all of these adult responsibilities, but also lacking in all of these built-in structures and relationships.
Yeah.
And that I find is something that I've needed to return to actively pursuing,
Hmm.
like actively building relationships and community and kind of look of I know I need structure, but I also resist structure and I just want total freedom.
Don't we all?
Yeah.
Isn't that how I relate to that, wanting
Yeah.
structure and not wanting it and wanting other people to do it for me and then
Yeah.
hating it, and yeah, I
Like
think
sometimes the best ways to get that creative access is to like have a dance class on my calendar that is
yeah,
scheduled for a 10-week session. And then it's, my after school activity.
absolutely. I know I was talking to someone earlier on a podcast about playing. He was talking about how he plays with technology, and that phrase playing with technology is something I don't hear a lot of adults use
Hmm.
when they're talking about their job. And so it kind of struck me as unique of
Yeah.
how people are kind of reframing for themselves what it is or how they do the things that most of us would call a job.
Hmm.
They're looking at it through that lens of play or that lens of creative opportunity.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a I don't know, it's a unique way to kind of look at the everyday things that we do in our life as adults.
Yeah. That's also, I mean, so much of what we're talking about, I feel like comes up in the type of coaching that I do. But often a theme that comes up is like, how can we add novelty to this? How can we add like challenge? How can we gamify that? Like giving the
Mm,
brain what it wants from an ADHD perspective, which is, that kind of dopamine hit
yeah.
or that very interest based brain. So, like, how to make it interesting.
Mhm.
But that's like kind of a very similar way of looking at things is not just like, what are all the things I need to do, but like, how can I make it more fun? Because otherwise, like, either I'm not going to do it or I'm going to do it and I'm going to just hate it the whole time.
Right. Well, for people who are listening who absolutely connect with that, what are some ways to make things a little more fun or to did you say novelize? Is that the word?
Yeah, like add
Novel
novelty.
Add novelty?
Um,
Yeah. Okay.
yeah, I think kind of like looking at looking at other things that you find fun is a good place to start drawing in inspiration. So, like, do you love music? Do you love movement? How can you then stack that into what you're doing?
Okay.
How can you build in these little reward systems, maybe even things as simple as like an old-fashioned star chart? For some people, that's enough to just like give the brain a little, ooh, shiny.
Yeah. Okay.
Like I did the thing, I get a star. So like stickers, things that we might associate with childhood and play, allowing ourselves to have a form of that in adulthood. And then adding in like an example of kind of gamifying something or adding in a little challenge is like when you set a timer and you're like, how much can I get done in 15 minutes?
Oh,
And it's different
yeah.
from person to person. Like some people that will just stress them out. But for some people to be like, okay, game on.
Yeah. If like gameplay was really your thing, that makes so
Yeah.
much
Or if
sense.
you're like competitive and you're like, I like a challenge. I like a
Yeah.
little.
Yeah. That's fascinating. What are the things that like how do you bring that novelty into your own regular activities? Is there a way that you approach kind of your everyday activities from that more novelty based or playful experience?
Yeah, I'm trying to think of if there are ways I weave it into kind of my everyday. The other thing about common to ADHD brains is not being able to remember even just like what just happened today.
Sure. Yeah.
I'm like, what do I even do in a day? What comes to mind is more often it's like around things that I know I want to do, but I know I'm going to put off. So it's not necessarily the day-to-day things, but like bigger creative goals.
Mm.
So
Mhm.
like a few years ago, I was like, I want to sing more regularly. And I was experimenting with that concept of, okay, how can I kind of make this more ADHD friendly?
Yeah.
And because I knew even though it was something that like no one was telling me I needed to sing more, no, like there was no external pressure.
Right. Yeah.
Um, it was just like something that I knew I wanted to be doing. And sometimes
Mhm.
that's not enough. Like that internal motivation is not enough to trigger activation. So
Right.
like differentiating between those two things. Um, so what I did was I set a little challenge for myself. I think it was 12 weeks where I was like, okay, every week I'm going to learn a new song that I've never sung in public before. So there was newness every week. It was like
Yeah.
every song was had novelty. And then I posted them on social media. So like at the end of every week, I would have to post myself
Yeah.
singing it, which also turned out to be a good exercise in letting go of perfectionism because obviously in a week's time,
Right.
it was not like where I would want it to be to put it out into the world.
Mhm.
Um, but just honoring like the intention, which was not to have a polished performance, it was to like
Right.
get myself to practice. So I had novelty, I had kind of the social accountability,
Yeah.
um, and then I had a timeline. So I had this like built-in deadlines and
Right.
that kind of time pressure. And I don't think I made it all 12 weeks because inevitably, like other
Yeah.
things will come up. I
Mhm.
think maybe I booked a show and then I was like, I have to actually rehearse the music for a show. I can't like just be learning a song, things like that. And, but it was still, I would say, really successful, which is another shift I've made, I think, since getting diagnosed with ADHD and kind of
Mhm.
delving into that world a bit more is not necessarily that I've changed the way I do everything, but I've definitely changed the way I look at things or,
Yeah.
what I view as successful,
Uh-huh.
and my expectations are different. Not that I've like lowered my expectations
Yeah.
in a negative way, but for me, I can be like, okay, it's okay if I did 10 out of 12 weeks. That was 10 weeks that I would not have done otherwise.
Right. Yeah. I love that idea of like taking that goal and giving yourself some action steps or activities that really work for you. It sounds
Mm-hmm.
like that was a great strategy that helped you achieve that goal. And if the goal was to sing more, whether you did it for 10 weeks or 12 weeks, you still achieved that goal of singing
Mm-hmm.
more on a regular basis, it sounds like. So,
Yeah, and allowing those like natural cycles to happen
yeah,
and not feeling like I need to, just because I'm trying to do it, I have to do it a certain way, or, you know,
right. Like
like,
plans can change too.
yeah.
That's there, it's allowed. We're able to function in different ways. Yeah. You strike me as someone who has a lot of kind of inspiration in your life, from the various things that you're interested in, the coaching clients that you work with. But I'm curious, like recently, who or what has been inspiring you?
Oh, that's a good question. Like recently, what recently? Definitely, definitely my clients. I mean, just like everyone is so different and working on such interesting things that's
Yeah.
always inspiring. Um, but also one of my, I guess you would call it a hobby, is reading like classic detective
Oh,
novels, like Agatha Christie type era.
yeah.
I'm working my way through Agatha Christie. Oh, I think I've read most of Agatha Christie's or listened to Dorothy Sayers, Niall Marsh, like that.
Yeah.
And I find them really interesting, not just, they're definitely like entertaining, but I've been thinking about recently, like, what is the difference between how much I like those? And I also listen to, because I'm burning through those, contemporary kind of historical
Mm-hmm.
fiction. So it's like set in the 20s, lady detective, kind of fluffy
Yeah. Love
novels.
those.
And I love them, but it's definitely, I feel differently about them than I do about the classics.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm reading a classic novel right now. And one of the things that I've noticed is there's actually a lot of like social commentary in there and a real insight into the times and like things that people were talking about and
Mm-hmm.
thinking about, and like attitudes and social constructs.
Yeah.
And it's just like a lot more complex and actually really interesting and deep in
Mm.
ways that I think we don't necessarily attribute to detective novels.
Sure. Female detective novels for
Detective,
sure.
yeah.
Yeah.
And I found that really kind of like creatively interesting and inspiring, but also there's something else in there that like just slipped in and out of my brain. Oh, I did a course, taught a course a little while back in the past year, um, around creativity. I don't think it was specifically ADHD focused. That one, it was like honor your art, I think was
Mm-hmm.
the title of it. And one of the themes that I talked about in there that I think kind of relates to that is the way that we judge art and how
Oh.
that also affects our own feelings about our own creativity. Like if we're
Mm-hmm.
constantly judging what is good and what's not good and what is worthy and what's not worthy of
Right.
existing as art in the world,
Yeah.
that then of course we're going to be judging our own art that way and might not create that thing, might not write that book or
Right.
play that song, because we're in this kind of subconscious space of this art is acceptable and worthy and valuable and good and this art is not.
Yeah. That makes sense. I mean, that's a fascinating way of kind of thinking about creativity and the subjectiveness of art and
Mm-hmm.
what and being allowed to have opinions, but not let your opinions drive what you choose to
Yeah,
do or how you show up in your own creative art space or creativity. So
and kind of
fascinating to,
separating um, criticism and critique. So there's like
Yeah.
critique where it's like coming from a neutral space of here's what I'm observing, here's what I personally like and dislike, here's what I think like on a technical level works well and doesn't work well.
Right.
Those are all valid things. Like there are, if I'm listening to someone sing, I can listen to them and be like, here's some things about their technique or their placement, their tone, or my personal preferences about this type of music or their personal voice.
Right.
And that's all, can be a part of just critiquing something from a neutral, judgment-free kind of space. And then there's like the part where it's like, ew, gross. Like,
right. That's
sing.
good. That's bad. That very dichotomous, all or nothing space that many of us, I know I have in my life gotten caught in that.
Yeah, me too. I'm totally like all the time. I'm like, what? But also that, it has inspired me to allow myself to try things when I see someone else who is out there doing it. And I'm like, well, that doesn't, I don't think their show is that great.
Right.
So then instead of being like, their show shouldn't exist, I just think to myself, I should probably try to create a show and like,
put your stamp or your expression out there too. Absolutely.
Sometimes how I think about it is reclaiming your right to be mediocre.
Oh, I love it. What a great phrase. Absolutely. This is a fascinating conversation. I'm sure we could keep going for quite some time, but I just have one last question for you.
Mm-hmm.
What does it feel like in your body to be creative?
I think it feels calm, like at ease, like there's a relaxation in it.
Yeah.
But not necessarily like a lack of energy. So there can be like a really humming, vibrant, even hyper-focused energy about it. But there's also kind of a calmness and a clarity that comes with that, where it's, different than the kind of fight or flight feeling of buzzingness. And it's more like, just that the excitement. I don't know if there's a weird way to describe it, but it's like the excitement is more, it's like really deep within.
Yeah.
It's like that's where the light is, and that light is kind of emanating out, but the rest can remain relaxed.
I love it. Yeah, that makes sense. I got it. I'm following you. I can have a visceral response to that, what you're describing and sharing. Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me. If people want to learn more about the things that you do, how could they go about doing that?
The best place to find me right now is probably on Instagram. And I'm at alignment_and_alchemy. I didn't think about the underscores when I made that and was like, oh, I'll have to say this out loud. But I think there's another one without, that isn't me. So I try to specify. And then my website is alignmentandalchemy.com. You can find me there also.
Perfect. I'll put those links in show notes so people have easy access. And thank you again for taking the time to chat with me. It has been such a treat.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Sustaining Creativity Podcast. We'd love to keep in touch, so follow us on Facebook and Instagram. We are at Sustaining Creativity. Make sure to subscribe to the podcast wherever you listen to podcasts. Tag your friends and family so they can listen too. We love to hear from you, so leave your reviews, comments, and questions. Check out our website, sustainingcreativity.com, for upcoming offerings and creativity coaching. Tune in Tuesdays for our next episode. And remember, with creativity, anything's possible.